In the early hours of April 30th, 1943, a lone fisherman was working off the coast of southern Spain when he noticed something drifting in the water. At first, it looked like wreckage. As he got closer, he realized it was the body of a man. The man was dressed in the uniform of a British Royal Marines officer. Strapped to his wrist was a briefcase secured with a chain, as though whatever it contained was more valuable than his own life. Spanish authorities quickly recovered the body. Everything about him seemed authentic. He carried identification papers, receipts, theater ticket stubs, letters from friends, and even a photograph of the woman he loved. His name, according to the documents in his pockets, was Major William Martin. But almost everything they had just discovered was a lie. That body had been placed there deliberately. The documents had been written specifically to be found. Even the love story inside his wallet had been carefully invented. It was all part of one of the most daring intelligence operations of the Second World War. A plan so unusual that many people refused to believe it was real when it was finally revealed years later. This is the true story of Operation Mincemeat. By the spring of 1943, the Second World War had reached a turning point. In North Africa, Allied forces had pushed the Axis armies toward defeat. For the first time, the momentum of the war was beginning to shift. But everyone knew the next move would be critical. The Allies needed to invade mainland Europe. The obvious first step was the island of Sicily. Located at the center of the Mediterranean, Sicily controlled the sea routes between Europe and North Africa. Capturing it would open the door to Italy itself, threaten German supply lines, and force Adolf Hitler to spread his forces across a wider front. There was only one problem. The Germans knew all of that too. To military planners in Berlin, Sicily was the most logical target. Its location made it almost impossible to ignore. If the Allies attacked there, German commanders would be waiting with reinforced defenses, prepared artillery positions, and additional troops. A direct assault could become a disaster. The Allies needed Germany to expect an invasion somewhere else, not just to wonder, not just to hesitate. They needed Hitler himself to become convinced that Sicily was nothing more than a distraction. It was an impossible challenge. How do you convince one of the largest intelligence networks in the world to believe something that simply isn't true? The answer wouldn't come from a battlefield. It wouldn't come from a spy behind enemy lines. It wouldn't even come from a coded radio message. Instead, British intelligence proposed something so extraordinary that, on paper, it sounded almost ridiculous. If Germany could be made to discover secret invasion plans entirely on its own, perhaps it would never question whether those plans were genuine. All they needed was someone to carry those documents, someone the Germans would trust completely, someone who could never reveal the truth. A dead man. And from that extraordinary idea, one of the greatest deception operations in military history quietly began. What sounds like an impossible idea had not appeared out of nowhere. Months earlier, British intelligence officers had been studying an unusual military paper written before the war by Royal Navy officer Ian Fleming. Long before he created James Bond, Fleming worked in naval intelligence and had compiled a list of imaginative deception techniques inspired by the way anglers trick fish into taking the bait. One suggestion was remarkably simple. Allow the enemy to accidentally discover information you wanted them to believe. The concept wasn't entirely new. Military deception had existed for centuries. But in 1943, two intelligence officers believed they could take that idea further than anyone had ever imagined. Their names were Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley. Montague was a successful barrister who had joined naval intelligence after the outbreak of war. Calm, methodical, and known for his attention to detail, he specialized in deception planning. Cholmondeley, an officer with the Royal Air Force in the 20 Committee, had spent months thinking about increasingly unconventional ways to mislead German intelligence. Together, they developed a proposal that many colleagues initially considered absurd. If the Germans could intercept a courier carrying secret invasion plans, they would almost certainly study every document they found. But sending a living courier behind enemy lines would be extraordinarily dangerous. If captured, he could reveal the operation under interrogation. A dead courier, however, would tell no one anything. The challenge was obvious. They first had to find the right body. It couldn't simply be any deceased person. The body had to resemble a healthy British officer in his early 30s. More importantly, the official cause of death needed to be consistent with someone who had drowned after an aircraft accident at sea. Finding such a body was far more difficult than anyone expected. Eventually, British authorities identified a suitable candidate in London. He was a homeless Welshman named Glyndwr Michael. Michael had died after ingesting a poison commonly used in rat control. At the time, doctors believed the poison had caused relatively little visible damage to his body, making him appear outwardly healthy. Modern historians have debated the exact medical details, but contemporary pathologists concluded that his remains could plausibly support the deception if examined after several days in the sea. His family was never involved in the operation, and for decades his identity remained a closely guarded secret. With the body secured, the planners faced an even greater challenge. They couldn't simply dress him in a uniform and hope for the best. They had to create a man who had never existed. Every pocket, every receipt, every handwritten note, every key, every habit, every tiny imperfection, if even one detail felt artificial, the entire operation could collapse. The officer they imagined became Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He was assigned a rank, military identification, and official responsibilities that would explain why he was carrying highly confidential documents. But that wasn't enough. Real people don't carry only military paperwork. They carry their lives. And so, British intelligence began constructing one of the most convincing fictional identities ever created. A wallet would soon tell a story. A handful of ordinary objects would become weapons. And somewhere inside that carefully assembled life, hidden among the receipts and love letters, lay a deception capable of changing the course of the Second World War. Creating Major William Martin was unlike any intelligence operation attempted before. British intelligence wasn't just forging documents, they were creating an entire human life. Every detail had to withstand the scrutiny of experienced German intelligence officers. These were men trained to detect forged papers, inconsistent stories, and even the smallest mistake. If anything felt out of place, the deception would fail. So the planners asked themselves a simple question. If Major Martin had really existed, what would he have carried in his pockets? The answer became what the British called his wallet litter. Instead of filling his pockets with only military documents, they filled them with ordinary pieces of everyday life. He carried used train tickets, receipts from London shops, a book of matches, a set of keys, loose coins, a letter from his bank reminding him about an overdraft. Even the smallest details mattered. His identity card showed signs of wear. His papers were folded naturally. Nothing looked new. Nothing appeared staged. The goal was simple. No one should believe these items had been prepared for an operation. They should look like the possessions of a man who had stopped thinking about them weeks earlier. But one detail became more important than all the others. Major William Martin needed someone waiting for him back home. British intelligence invented a young woman they called Pam. She was portrayed as Martin's fiancée. A photograph of her was placed inside his wallet. Alongside it were affectionate handwritten letters filled with the kind of small personal details that only a real couple might share. The woman in the photograph was not an actress hired for the mission. She was a real person. Her name was Jean Leslie. Leslie worked for the British intelligence services and agreed to let her photograph become part of the deception. Years later, she would recall how strange it felt to become the fictional fiancé of a man who had never existed. The planners even included a jeweler's receipt for an engagement ring, suggesting that Martin had recently purchased it for Pam. There were personal letters from his father, a notice from his tailor, a receipt for a recently purchased shirt. Every object told another small piece of his life. Individually, none of these items proved anything. Together, they created something remarkably convincing, a personality. The remarkable thing is that almost none of these objects had any military value. Yet they became some of the most important pieces of evidence the Germans would eventually examine. Because spies expect to find secrets. Ordinary life is much harder to fake. As the weeks passed, the fictional Major William Martin, became increasingly real to the men creating him. Some members of the team even found themselves speaking about him as though he were an actual officer. That was exactly the reaction they hoped the enemy would have. If the British themselves could almost forget he was fictional, perhaps the Germans would never question him at all. Soon, only one piece of the plan remained. They had to place Major Martin exactly where German intelligence would find him, and they had only one chance to get it right. By April 1943, Major William Martin was finally ready for his mission. Only one problem remained. How do you deliver a dead man to enemy intelligence without revealing the deception? The answer came from the Royal Navy. The submarine chosen for the mission was HMS Seraph, commanded by Lieutenant Norman Jewell. Only a handful of people aboard knew what they were carrying. To everyone else, the sealed metal container loaded onto the submarine was classified cargo. Inside rested the body of Glinder Michael, preserved with dry ice to slow decomposition during the voyage. On April 19th, HMS Seraph quietly departed Scotland and began its journey south through the Atlantic. Its destination was the coast of Huelva in southwestern Spain. The location had been chosen with great care. Spain was officially neutral during the war, but many senior officials maintained friendly relations with Germany. British intelligence believed there was a strong chance that any sensitive documents recovered by Spanish authorities would eventually find their way into German hands. That was exactly what they wanted. After several days at sea, HMS Seraph reached the Spanish coastline before dawn on April 30th. Commander Jewell waited patiently for darkness to give way to the first light of morning. Timing was everything. Too early, and no one might discover the body. Too late, and witnesses could see the submarine. Just before sunrise, the crew carried the body onto the submarine's deck. Major William Martin was dressed in his Royal Marines uniform. The leather briefcase containing the secret documents was securely chained to his wrist. Before releasing the body into the sea, the crew observed a brief moment of silence. Although the mission depended on deception, they understood they were handling the remains of a real man. Commander Jewell then ordered the body committed to the water. The current slowly carried Major Martin toward the Spanish shore. Within minutes, HMS Seraph disappeared beneath the surface and quietly sailed away. From that moment on, there was nothing more the British could do. Months of planning now depended entirely on chance. Would the body be discovered? Would the briefcase remain attached? Would Spanish authorities examine the documents? Would the Germans believe any of it? In London, the waiting began. Every passing day brought new uncertainty. The operation had been carefully planned down to the smallest detail. But once the body entered the sea, history itself would decide whether Operation Mincemeat became one of Britain's greatest victories or one of its most embarrassing failures. As dawn broke over the coast of southern Spain, the success of Operation Mincemeat rested entirely in the hands of strangers. Later that morning, a local fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria spotted a body floating offshore near Huelva. At first, he believed it was the victim of a shipwreck or an aircraft accident. As he approached, he discovered a British officer wearing a life jacket with a leather briefcase securely chained to his wrist. Spanish authorities were quickly notified. The body was brought ashore and examined by local officials. Everything appeared consistent with a man who had drowned at sea. His uniform was authentic. His identification seemed genuine. His pockets contained the ordinary belongings of someone living an entirely normal life. Nothing immediately suggested deception. Exactly as British intelligence had hoped, the briefcase attracted immediate attention. The Spanish authorities understood that any military documents carried by a British officer could be of great importance. Before long, news of the discovery reached German agents operating in Spain. The Germans did not simply steal the documents. Instead, they relied on discreet cooperation from sympathetic officials who quietly allowed the contents of the briefcase to be examined. The envelopes appeared unopened, but appearances can be deceiving. Specialists carefully opened the sealed letters without leaving obvious signs of tampering. The documents were photographed page by page. Every word was copied. Every signature was studied. Once finished, the letters were resealed as carefully as possible and returned to Spanish custody. Soon afterward, the briefcase and its contents were officially handed back to the British. At first glance, everything appeared untouched. That was precisely what the Germans wanted the British to believe. Back in London, however, intelligence officers immediately began searching for evidence that someone had secretly opened the documents. The operation had included several hidden safeguards. Tiny fibers had been placed inside sealed envelopes. Paper folds had been carefully measured. Even the smallest changes could reveal whether another set of hands had handled the letters. As experts began examining every document, the tension inside British intelligence headquarters became almost unbearable. Had the Germans ignored the briefcase altogether? Had they believed the deception? Or had months of careful planning ended in complete failure? No one knew. All they could do was wait for the first signs of what Adolf Hitler believed. The first signs of success did not come from the documents themselves. They came from German behavior. British intelligence had expected the briefcase to be secretly examined, but proving that it had happened was another matter entirely. After inspecting every envelope with extraordinary care, they found that tiny fibers that had been trapped beneath the seals had shifted. Paper folds no longer matched their original positions. The letters had been opened, then carefully closed again. It was exactly what the planners had hoped to find. Still, had the Germans believed what they had read? For several anxious days, no one knew. Then British codebreakers at Bletchley Park began intercepting German communications. Although the exact details remained classified for decades, the messages revealed something remarkable. German commanders were discussing the possibility that the next Allied invasion would not strike Sicily directly. Instead, they believed the real attacks were likely to fall on Greece and Sardinia. The false documents carried by Major William Martin had delivered precisely that message. Even more encouraging, the misinformation appeared to be moving rapidly through the German chain of command. Reports reached senior military leaders. Eventually, the information arrived at Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler had long believed that the Allies might attempt to attack the Balkans. The documents found on Major Martin seemed to confirm that suspicion. As a result, German forces began preparing for threats that did not exist. Additional troops were sent toward Greece. Defensive resources were strengthened in Sardinia and Corsica. Meanwhile, Sicily, the Allies' true objective, received fewer reinforcements than it otherwise might have. Historians continue to debate exactly how much Operation Mincemeat influenced every German decision. Military planning is rarely shaped by a single piece of intelligence, but there is broad agreement that the operation reinforced existing German fears and contributed to the redistribution of Axis forces away from Sicily. For the British planners, that was more than enough. The deception had achieved its purpose. Without firing a single shot, they had persuaded the enemy to prepare for battles that would never take place. Now, only one final test remained: the Allied invasion itself. If the Germans had truly accepted the deception, the beaches of Sicily would tell the story, and the fate of one anonymous man would soon become part of one of the most successful intelligence operations in military history. On July 10, 1943, more than 2 months after Major William Martin washed ashore in Spain, the Allies launched Operation Husky. Over 160,000 British, American, and Canadian troops landed in Sicily. The fighting was fierce, but the invasion succeeded. Between historians, there is broad agreement on one point. The deception reinforced Hitler's belief that Greece and the eastern Mediterranean were likely invasion targets, contributing to the diversion of German forces away from Sicily at a critical moment. Operation Mincemeat had done exactly what it was designed to do. The operation remained secret for years after the war, and so did the true identity of Major William Martin. Glyndŵr Michael, the man behind that famous name, was a homeless Welshman who died alone in London at the age of 34. He never knew the role he would play in history. Today, he is buried in Huelva, Spain. His gravestone honors both identities: Major William Martin, the fictional Royal Marines officer, and Glyndŵr Michael, the real man whose body helped carry out one of the greatest deception operations of the Second World War. It is a remarkable reminder that history is not shaped only by generals, politicians, or famous commanders. Sometimes It is changed by ordinary people whose names were almost forgotten. Because history doesn't need to be exaggerated. Sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that truly happened. This was a real tale from history.